Hi, everyone, and welcome to In Contrast. My name is Alan.
And I'm Nisha.
And on this podcast, we talk about movies and the books that they're based on.
The catch is you watch the movie and I read the book, with a few exceptions.
That's right. And today we got a pretty straightforward one, a very well-known book, To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yes, by Harper Lee. Not Harper Collins, as I might say.
It will inevitably happen.
It will probably happen. And if it happens, just know that I know it's Harper Lee, not Harper Collins.
Was not published by Harper Collins. However, Go Set a Watchman was.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
But yeah, so this is a extremely well-known book. The movie's also talked about quite a lot. For a movie as old as it is, it's definitely held up in, people's estimations. It's still talked about a lot. I'm sure that some of that has to do with how present this book is in American school curriculums.
Yes, and discourse in general.
But yeah, so, lots of people, read the book while they're in school. They inevitably watch the movie one day while they're discussing it. These are just things that happen all the time. Despite it being so present in things like schools, it doesn't do so without some controversy.
No, there's a lot of controversy about it, which we won't get into too much. We're mostly talking about the book and the movie, but
for sure,
I think we should mention it.
Some of it, I think fits in with some of the things that we'll inevitably talk about when discussing this. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not that, either of us are in favor of book banning or anything, but some of the conversation around why people feel that way certainly fits in.
Yeah, and if it needs to be the book that's in the curriculum still, it had its place.
Sure.
But are there better books to put? I think adapting school curriculums and updating them is a good idea.
It can be very smart, yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, so why don't you, this is, again, I said it's a somewhat straightforward episode. This was, book published in 1960, movie adaptation made in 1962.
The book won a Pulitzer in 1961, by the way.
It sure did.
Yes.
Yeah, it was very well received pretty much right out of the gates, with some exception.
Mm-hmm. Despite her publisher or agent saying that it would not be.
Right, yeah. There was definitely a setup for her of being like, hey, this might not turn out so well.
Temper your expectations.
Right, but it was a big hit.
Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah, 2 years after the publication, this movie was released, and it's pretty much been the only adaptation put to screen since the book was released.
Yeah. Are there any others that you know? Nothing. No TV movies, nothing. Nothing. That's fascinating.
At least not that I'm aware of. Nothing even close to mainstream, being present in mainstream at all.
Yeah. Maybe something that is harder to find, but we don't know about it.
Frankly, I don't think it exists.
Yeah, probably doesn't. I imagine it would have turned up in your research.
And again, we're obviously going to get into the conversation of how do we feel about this story in general and this and that, but ultimately our question is, how does the adaptation serve the source, or vice versa?
Yes.
And, this is a key, indicator that an adaptation was made and no one has really felt the need to redo it since then.
Yeah, if you get it right the first time, why do it again?
Right.
That being said, there are movies that people just like making again and again again and again.
And frankly, given how present this book is in pop culture and just people's minds in general, kind of surprised no one else has given it a shot.
Yeah. So I have a question right out the gate.
Yes.
I think I saw the movie a long time ago.
Most likely you did.
Probably. Is Atticus as hot as I think he was?
It's Gregory Peck.
Okay.
Yeah, in his prime. He's definitely,
Okay.
He's just serving up justice and being hot and, teaching his kids good lessons. And,
okay.
Yeah.
That was kind of what I remember about the movie, is that he was really hot.
It's definitely a point of discussion.
Okay. All right. Good. And I think Atticus is supposed to be a pretty good-looking man.
Yeah.
But just wanted to make sure.
Despite this book, we'll get into, describing the book and what happens, but, it's not from Atticus's perspective. It's from his young daughter's perspective, yes. Scout. But I think that Atticus is really the character that has, maintained its presence in people's minds over the years.
Yeah, I mean, he is the one kind of doing the big things in the story.
Right.
And you're seeing it through his kid's perspective, basically.
Right. Which is interesting. And, you know, I'll let you get into some of this, but, you know, there's definitely a tinge of, like, autobiography to this from,
yeah,
you know, Harper Lee writing this from her perspective as, like, the scout character, basically.
Yeah, so this is basically, honestly, I would call it, like, a slice of life story. Mm-hmm. Slice of life tends to be a little bit more positive, though, and this is quite a dark book. On Wikipedia, it says it's Southern Gothic.
Well, that's a source of a lot of debate.
I am in on that debate. I don't think it's Southern Gothic. I don't think that makes sense at all.
I think that the only reason why that's thrown around is because of the Boo Radley character.
Yeah.
And I think it's because it's, like, when you're looking at the surface level of the story, it's not a Southern Gothic.
No.
It's only because it's viewed through this lens of young children.
Yeah.
That I think that some, like, more magical or otherworldly elements get introduced.
Yeah.
And that's where the argument lies. But I would say at its source, it's not.
Yeah. So really, I actually have a bit of a hard time describing what this book is about. And I'm glad I had a little bit of time after finishing this book to coming to the podcast, because it took me all that time to figure out how to describe the book. But it's basically the story of two kids' lives in, 1930s Alabama. Mm-hmm. It's based on Harper Lee, her experience growing up in Monroeville, Alabama in 1936 when she was 10.
Right.
So it is heavily influenced that. And if you really read into it, you hear that Boo Radley is based on someone that she knew. Mm-hmm. A lot of what was happening is based on people she knew. So it is very, very autobiographical.
Yes. It's kind of tying together, like, things that she experienced very close to her, things she heard about throughout her childhood that may or may not have happened nearby her or somewhere else. And she's kind of combining all these things into a story.
Yes.
You know?
And I'm going to guess most people who are listening know that there's a trial about a black man, and that is a huge point of the story, but it's actually in the background for the majority of the story. Mm-hmm. And it is brought forward in that Scout, the girl whose perspective it's through, is getting bullied and teased because her father is defending a black man. But even that doesn't happen, like, all the time. There's plenty of instances where they're just trying to figure out Boo Radley, who, by the way, we should say, is a recluse who lives in a house nearby. Mm-hmm. And they just never see him until maybe later.
Right.
We'll get into that later. But
mysterious figure, you know, like, obviously kids always will take things and run, so there's a lot of kind of mythology around him. And,
yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's an interesting character.
So let's talk about perspective.
Okay.
How is the movie presented? Because obviously perspective in books and movies is very, very different.
Yes.
Movies have the freedom to jump from one person to the other. Books don't really do that too often.
Right.
So the book is from Scout's perspective.
Yes.
How is the movie presented?
The same.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll say now that this is another case where that I have read this book at least twice, I think once in school and once as an adult. And so I do have some, you know, like, it's been a while. I don't have, like, a perfect memory about it or anything, but I do have some frame of reference for the book. So, yeah, it's basically the same in the movie. You know, the story's presented by Scout. It's from her perspective as a kid. That's the only thing that's filmed is her as a child, right? Mm-hmm. Kind of growing up and over a span of a couple of years. And there is some occasional, like, maybe 3 or 4 times, there's, like, some voiceover narration as her as an adult, which also occurs in the book.
You know, that's kind of interesting in that some of the reception to the book was that people thought it was too well written for a child's perspective. But it's all in the past tense. Right. So I don't see why you couldn't say, yes, it's from a child's perspective, but she's reflecting.
Right.
You know, so that didn't take me out at all. I thought it was perfectly fine that it was from a child's perspective, but written in a way that's coherent and eloquent and makes sense.
You have to frame these things appropriately, right? This is, like you said, it's being approached as an adult looking back.
Yeah.
And so, obviously, your adult brain is going to fill in some of the things your child brain was interpreting, you know?
Yes.
And you're going to understand those things more deeply and then be able to assign meaning to it retroactively, right? So,
yes. If it was written in the present tense, I might be a little bit more like, why is this so eloquent?
Sure.
But it's not. It's written in past tense. So you can assume the events of the stories have already happened. You are not reading it as it happens.
Absolutely.
So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing, that people were upset about that, but I didn't feel that way at all.
Right. And it's worth mentioning, like, this is probably the only discussion we'll have about this, but about Go Set a Watchman.
Yeah.
It's not even something I've read. I don't know a whole lot about it, but what I do know about it is that it was essentially an early draft of To Kill a Mockingbird. It's not really a sequel, even though that's the way it was presented.
Yeah.
But what it basically was Scout as a, I think, like, late 20s adult coming back to make them.
Interesting.
And then kind of remembering some of this stuff. So I think that was transitioned rather than it focusing on her as an adult. It was her thinking back as a kid, but only seeing it from the kid's perspective. That's what the book ultimately turned into.
Okay, yeah.
So I think that played with that kind of...
Yeah.
It balanced it correctly, I think, in the end. I don't think it's quite as compelling if you're 100% seeing it from her as an adult.
Yeah, absolutely. And you want to get lost a little bit in the whimsy of it being a child, you know?
Yeah.
You want to...
It's one of the great strengths of this story, really.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
So then, just to ask you that question, since you were mentioning it, you do think this is a well-written book, overall? Like, the way she uses words and things. Would that be accurate?
Technically, it's a well-written book, yes.
Right. Not so much the story, I mean, like, the actual prose.
Yeah, the prose, it feels like a well-written book, absolutely. I will say, I do think the N-word is used a few too many times.
Sure, and we'll get into that, for sure. It's definitely part of the conversation.
Yeah, it is part of the conversation. But overall, I do think it's a well-written book. And I would say it doesn't feel like it glorifies the usage of any slurs or anything like that.
No, it's quite the opposite.
Yeah.
But at least in terms of, what it was attempting to do.
Yes.
There's definitely conversation to be had about how effective it was.
Yeah.
It's also, I think this is going to be an interesting conversation between the two of us, because I'm a white man that grew up in the South.
Yeah.
And I've seen the way that people talk about things and the way that they approach certain situations and how they treat certain people.
Yeah.
And not to say that you haven't seen those things, but it's like such an ingrained part of Southern culture. So the fact that this book is set in the South is extremely important.
Yeah.
To what it's trying to accomplish. So it's, I'm not going to say that we can't have a conversation about, like, could it have done something better, but, like, I'm definitely going to be approaching it from that perspective of how bad things can be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it is the case that, like, for me, I'm mixed race, but I grew up in California and super liberal, like, the racism we saw is completely different from what is ingrained in the South. I mean, the history of the South. You had friends with houses that had like shackles still on them from colonial eras.
Yeah, like plantation houses.
Yeah, we didn't have that here. So I actually don't know if you remember, but I asked if you had read the book because I thought this was a book you should have more perspective on, because this is something I really don't know a lot about.
Right.
I mean, I can understand racism.
Of course, but it's from a different lens.
But it's from a completely different lens. It's honestly a completely different culture. The South is super different from California.
And you were raised liberal. I was not. I was raised conservative.
Yeah.
There's definitely some racist tendencies in my family.
Yeah.
And then not to mention just being in California, like, there's plenty of racism around.
Yes.
Don't get me wrong, but there's a lot more open-minded liberal people that you would have grown up around, whereas, we're looking at this as like, in other words, your family being, thinking that way was not a notable thing around here, right?
Yeah,
like it would have been in the South. But,
Had my family been in the South, we would have been extremely liberal. And here we're like pretty par for the course.
Yeah, just kind of, that's how it is, right?
Yeah, I don't know a lot of people who disagrry with us on like at least broad topics.
Right.
Maybe if you really get to the nitty gritty, how things should be dealt with, things like that. But and that's actually I'm really glad you're Southern. Because that is something that I just don't know about. And that is like, for me, it's like, yeah, wow, they use the N-word a lot. But for you, is that like, honestly, it feels kind of like what it would be like.
It kind of is. That's, again, I think there's a conversation to be had, which we should get into some of the bare bones basics of the story first. But, ultimately, I think that the usage of the N-word is not necessarily the problem in this book.
Yes.
Because I do think it's accurate, and I think it represents that type of person that this book is exploring.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you have to question some of the other aspects being paired with that.
Yes.
So, like, I mean, let's just say up front, there's definitely a tinge, you can debate how much you think there is, but of like a white savior narrative to this story. Of how much are we exploring the perspectives of the black people living in this town?
Yeah, are they multidimensional or are they,
And again, you can have this back and forth of, okay, well, we're seeing it through this one perspective, so is she going to understand all of that or not? But, so that's really the conversation to me, is not like, oh, well, this book uses the N-word too much. It's like, it uses all this stuff, but then does it appropriately give you the other side as well?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I also feel like I'm not really the person to delve too deeply into that, which, again, that's not what the podcast is about. But, it's really, the controversy around this book is fascinating.
It really is.
It really is fascinating. Because it is, at the end of the day, she's not trying to do anything bad. She's trying to say, like, this is the way it was. Right. This is what people dealt with.
And then, so we're approaching this from two different standpoints on that, because it's, to certain people, it's going to seem like this is a really surface level, like not very deep, like racism's bad, finger wag kind of thing. Yeah. But like from a perspective of a kid that grew up in a situation like that, like it's deeply ingrained. Yeah. So even a surface level lesson as a child is really important. Just to have that like kind of perspective of like, hey, you should try to be a good person and be empathetic towards people even if you don't understand them or they're different than you. Like, it's such a, like, in 2024 as an adult, it's like a, well, yeah, duh. Yeah. But, like, as a kid growing up in the South, it's not that simple.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I think there's definitely value in the book. I think it's now in 2024 is the era of there are new books that we could be using, basically. Absolutely. Like, I think it served its purpose.
I even, like, use this in tandem with something more up-to-date just to see, like, progression and different ways of viewing things.
Yeah, absolutely. And how we've grown as people,
Right, which is an important...
It is important,
It's important to note how we've grown and how we haven't,
Yeah.
Like both at the same time, so...
All right, let's talk about the story.
Okay.
So, I genuinely don't know how to talk about this story. It's so slice of life.
It is. I mean, it's, it covers a pretty large swath of, a childhood.
It does. It covers a couple years, I think, or like 3 years or something like that.
I believe in the book it's like 3 years. I think in the movie it presents it more as about 1.5 years.
Yeah. Yeah, so in the book, it kind of revolves around, a little bit around school, but a lot of it is when Dill is in town. Right. So the first few chapters is when we meet Dill, we learn about the family's history. I gotta tell you, right out the gate, they are info dumping.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they are like, let me give you all this information. You learn about Calpurnia, who I actually thought was really interesting. They don't mention she's black for a few chapters. Right. I think it might be the third chapter or something, maybe the second, that they mention that she's black.
And she is like kind of the, I don't know what to call her, a maid nanny for the house, the Finch household.
Yeah, she's the housekeeper.
The housekeeper.
Yeah.
She doesn't live there, but she takes care of the kids.
And sometimes she does stay there.
Right.
And, she's a huge part of the family. Yeah. Then they talk about Boo Radley, and Dill suggests they lure him out. And that's when... Okay, Jem or Jim?
It's Jim, which, like, yeah, it's spelled Jem.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. It's Jim. I don't know.
Jim? See, that's like there's like a southern twang to it.
There's a southern twang. It doesn't, it's Jim, you know?
Yeah, okay, so I'm just going to call him Jim.
It's Jim.
Dill convinces Jim to run over, touch the house.
So real quick, Dill is a kid from out of town. He lives a state over or something. He's visiting over the summer, over these couple years.
Yeah.
He visits his aunt that lives in Macomb.
Yes.
So.
Yes. And Jim is Scout's older brother.
Right.
So they go to... Dill convinces Jim to not be a coward, and it takes like 3 days for Dill to convince Jim to touch Boo Radley's house. And then they literally run to the house, run back, and Scout says that she thought she saw the shutters moving. Mm-hmm. So she thinks someone saw them.
Right.
Is that in the movie?
Less so. It's kind of, you know, there's like multiple instances of their kind of back and forth trying to, you know, get Boo Radley to come out or try to understand him or this or that. And some of it's like kind of combined in the movie.
Yeah.
It's definitely condensed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, again, how long is the movie?
It's about 2 hours.
2 hours, yeah. So
and some change.
It took me like 8 hours to listen to the book. And
Right.
yes, I did listen to it again.
Which, just up front, you had said a little earlier that, like, the book, the trial is kind of in the background.
Yeah.
I would say that the movie centralizes it.
Yeah.
It is kind of the central feature of the movie. Not that other things don't happen, but they definitely incorporate almost everything about the trial into the movie, and in favor of, like, removing some of the other stuff.
Yeah, I don't think it's until, say, chapter 9 or 10 or somewhere around there that they first even mention anything in relation to the trial.
Because there's so much time that's passing before that even happens, right? There's so
Yeah.
much setup. And I think that's where that difference between like a year and a half versus 3 years with the book and the movie.
Yeah.
I think that's where the bulk of that comes from, because there's a lot of setup. Like, Dill has visited a couple times, I think, before the trial starts in the book.
Yeah.
That's less so the case. It kind of presents it as all of this is starting in that first summer.
Okay.
You know, at least the conversation about it starting. You know, it's not entirely clear, like, how much time is passing, but it makes it pretty clear that at least all that's happening in the same summer.
Yeah.
You know, so they set up the neighborhood and some of the characters, and they start talking about Boo Radley and all this stuff, but then, like, basically the end of that summer is when the trial starts. Like, the judge comes to the Finch household to tell Atticus he's on the case, like, I think 15 minutes into the movie.
Yeah. We don't even see the judge until the trial in the book. So, well, let me run through some of this stuff then. Scout goes to school. Mm-hmm. She and her teacher don't get along. Walter Cunningham, excuse me. He's this poor guy his family can't afford anything. Jim invites him over for lunch. Then Scout and Calpurnia fight, and they fight a lot. There's a lot of just Scout fighting with people, and then Scout not wanting to go to school. Mm-hmm. And then there's the next summer. Right. So there's already 1 year has passed in the first 4 chapters.
Yeah. And they do hit on some of this. Like, so that first summer happens where Dill first visits. She goes to school for the first time. She's 6 years old, so she's starting school, you know, for the very first time. And then, yeah, she gets into fights with her teachers and some of her classmates and stuff. All that is in the movie.
Yeah, so she only gets into a fight with one teacher, really, and I wouldn't even say she does much fighting, you know?
Yeah.
But she's just trying to, like, tell her teacher the ways of the place. And it's a kind of interesting scene where the teacher's trying to give Walter Cunningham a quarter or something to buy some food. And she's like, "Oh, Miss Caroline, he's a Cunningham." And Miss Caroline's like, "What does that mean?" And she's like, "He's a Cunningham."
Right.
But it means that he's from a family where they don't take things that they can't pay back.
Right.
So
They're a very poor family.
Yes. So he will not take the quarter.
And this is a lesson that her father has taught her, that Atticus has taught her, because it's, at least in the film, I don't remember if this is in the book, but that very early on, Atticus, comes face to face, like basically the Mr. Cunningham, Walter, he comes to visit the house.
Yeah.
Because Atticus has done some legal work for him.
Yeah.
But he doesn't have a way to pay him, so he brings vegetables and things to help pay for it. And so he explains that, to Scout that Mr. Cunningham's not the type of person that's going to let him do it for free. In other words, he's going to pay him in some way or another.
Yeah. So Scout already knows that in the book, and Scout explains that, having had her father explain it, and she saw the bushels of potatoes and stuff like that coming to the house for the legal services, and how Atticus said, just consider it paid. Which I think is great. Why not let people pay in food, right?
Absolutely. And this is a point that becomes very poignant later on in the story.
Yes, absolutely. So we're on to the next summer, and they create, Dill is back. Jim and Scout and Dill create a game called Boo Radley, where they play as the Radley family. And, somewhere in this, Mr. Radley dies, and I don't remember where that is in the book, but it's in the earlier chapters.
I don't think that happens at all in the movie.
I mean, it's such a, I don't know how you would fit it in there. There's a whole point about Mr. Radley dying, and then Nathan Radley, I believe he's the older son, Boo Radley being the younger son. Maybe the other way, I'm not sure. But, also, Boo Radley went to prison and all this stuff. And he didn't actually go to prison. He was locked in the basement of the courthouse. And, there's all this.
Right. He, tried to stab his mother or something.
Something
was the
like
story.
that. Yeah.
But, of course, this is, again, from the kid's perspective. Where they're there's, some haunted dungeon in the basement of the courthouse that he was locked up in for years or something,
Yes. So that's what we call an unreliable narrator. Right. And I would say Scout is definitely an unreliable narrator. Sure. And I maintain that this is an adult looking back on, or older, even teenage Scout looking back on her childhood and presenting what happened in her childhood.
Right. Both from the perspective of a child and just kind of through some false memory, probably.
Probably, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And she's not saying that nowadays she believes all that stuff. She's saying that's what we believed as kids.
Right, exactly.
But yeah, so they play Boo Radley. There's a lot of Scout spends time with Miss Maudie Atkinson, who lives, I think, across the street from them. Who says, Boo Radley, first off, call him Arthur, which is also the name of the father who dies.
Right.
Are false, and that, there's just so much. This is my issue with the book. Okay, we're gonna get into this. It's just stuff happening. Mm-hmm. And there's no, real story until the trial starts happening. Sure.
That's the narrative story, yes.
Yeah.
The trial.
So it just feels like it's this wandering, day to day things are happening, and I don't know how to summarize it. And I have Spark Notes open in front of me right now.
Ultimately, you don't need to, really.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of the point, right? These aren't things that individually matter, per se.
Yeah.
They're to build an understanding of the type of people that Scout grew up around.
Yes.
The kinds of lessons she learned from different people.
Yes.
The different perspectives from her father versus neighbors and different,
Yes.
There's different people of different classes around her. I mean, it's all small town Alabama, so no one's rich, you know. But there is some slightly lower middle class versus dirt poor people.
Yeah.
And kind of the different perspectives there. And so she learns different lessons from different people. And I think that's ultimately the point of all these things just kind of happening.
Yeah. Yeah. So all this stuff is happening. Dill is leaving Maycomb, which is spelled Maycomb, so Maycomb if you are Californian. Maycomb if you are Southern. I thought it was Maycomb, Georgia.
That's Macon.
Oh, Macon, Georgia. Okay. Right. See, I don't understand Southern accents. So this is when Scout Jim and Dill peer through the window at the Radley's place, and Mr. Nathan Radley, so Daddy Radley's died by then. Mm-hmm. Mr. Nathan Radley has apparently tried to shoot at a black man in his backyard. Uh-huh. it is understandably the three children who are scrambling out.
Correct.
I would say this is one of the best scenes in that Jim loses his pants.
Yes. Which, in the movie, is not even really explained. Like, he kind of gets, like, stuck on something, it says, but then it's just like, oh, he just has no pants now.
Well, and then they appear, because they're like, oh, if we're not at the Radley's place, people are going to wonder where we are.
Uh-huh.
So they appear at the crowd around the Radley's place,
Right.
and Atticus is like, where are your pants? And they're like, ugh. And Dill says, oh, we were playing strip poker.
I didn't remember any of that.
Oh my gosh. But that's like a terrible excuse.
Yeah.
Because Atticus, there's nothing worse in the family than gambling.
Oh, yeah.
So
okay.
Atticus is like, I'm sorry, you were doing what? Yeah. And so I think Jim is like, we were playing with matches.
Just like all the worst things.
And Atticus is like, just go get your pants. So in the middle of the night, and it sounds like Jim maybe only has one pair of pants.
Yeah, potentially. Because
he has to go get the pants. But that's when he finds the pants mended on the fence.
Right.
But he sneaks out in the middle of the night, and like Scout is like, I'm gonna wake Atticus, which by the way, they call their father Atticus.
They do, yeah.
Is that something, I mean, okay, obviously you were not raised in the 30s in the South, but did you have any friends who
Oh, no.
No.
Absolutely
It
not.
was all mommy, daddy,
that would have
mama.
been very...
Mama.
Or just sir, ma'am.
Sir, ma'am? Oh, boy.
I mean, no, that's a very noteworthy thing about it, I think.
Yeah. So for me, my father and his siblings actually referred to their father as Lloyd. Mm-hmm. My grandfather's name was Lloyd.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it was really interesting. So there was like, I wouldn't say family drama, but there was this moment of like, as we grow up, like, what do we call my dad? Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, he stuck with daddy from me. But I'm just not going to call my dad Steve.
No.
I'm not going to call him.
No, it's an odd thing. And I definitely saw a couple kids, growing up who would refer to their parents by their first name. And it was not, received well, let's say that. Okay. Generally followed by, boy, I'm going to paint your behind red.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, and in the book, it is notable that they call him Atticus. Like, people are like, why are you calling him Atticus? And stuff like that, but that's what they call him.
Yeah.
And
it was basically a thing that Jim had started, and then Scout followed suit.
Yeah, yeah.
Calling him that.
He doesn't care. He's really, he's a pretty cool guy.
Yes, he's a great character. He really is.
He is. He's a pretty great character. So in the movie, Jim loses his pants.
Yeah, so it all happens a little faster than that. It's not quite the same. Like, basically, they're already out at night. Not in the middle of the night, but just, it's dark.
Yeah, yeah.
They go to the house, and then they kind of run away. He gets stuck, but they get loose,
Yeah.
And then Dill runs off.
Yeah.
And it's actually quite funny because... it's presented as though this is at the end of the summer, so like all three kids, like they make it to the Finch yard or whatever, and then Dill is like, all right, see y'all next summer. He runs away, and then he's just gone till next summer. But then Scout and Jim are like, okay, well, I need to get my pants. So Scout waits, and he goes and gets them. She hears a gunshot, and then he comes back, holding his pants, and basically is just like, he doesn't say this then. But he reveals much, much later, once they start figuring things out about Boo Radley, he reveals that he found the pants folded up on top of the fence instead of stuck.
Yeah.
Not fully mended or anything because not enough time had passed, but, it still gets across that, like, someone was looking out for him.
Yeah, and it's very similar to what happens in the book. I should point out the reason they're at the Radley's place is they want to give a note to Boo Radley, and they have, like, a fishing pole, and they're trying to, like, get it in a window.
It's just... it's so funny.
Yeah, and
it's like that episode of SpongeBob when Mr. Krabs is trying to show him the ghost on the piece of paper.
Yes, yes. Yeah, it's basically the same thing. So, as we might have mistakenly not done, we should have watched that episode of SpongeBob
that's part
to
of this.
Also compare it to To Kill a Mockingbird. So they go back to school now. Dill, so this does the whole pants debacle of 1935 happens, and then Dill has to leave like the next day. So that is similar, but
not
Dill,
quite as like,
but not quite as like, okay, bye. So they go back to school, and there's a tree with a knot hole where they start finding gifts, and they find like gum and stuff like that. And I don't know, like, if it's a Southern thing, you'll have to tell me. Would you put gum in your mouth that you just found in a tree?
as a kid, maybe.
Okay, because I would not have. I should also probably say I was a child with severe anxiety.
Right.
So I probably would have not have even touched it. I would have just been like, oh, there's something in the tree. Bye. That's then when winter happens. Do you guys have winter at all in the movie?
No, it's not really touched on, at least not for the first year. Like, they say it's winter on the other end, like, kind of in closing.
Yeah.
But no, it's not really, like, a big thing.
It's very notable in the book because it actually snows.
Oh.
And it doesn't snow that much in the South usually, right?
No,
it depends where you are.
But yeah.
But I guess in Alabama, at least this area of Alabama, it doesn't really snow.
Yeah.
So they're able to build a snowman, which looks like Mr. Avery, who's a real piece of work. And he's saying something about how naughty children make it snow, and he's like, it's gonna snow because you kids have been bad, or something like that. And then it snows, and the kids are like, yay! So it wasn't a very good threat.
Didn't teach a good lesson there.
No, absolutely not. And then they build a snowman that looks like him, and Atticus is like, that looks so much like him, you actually have to disguise it. But it's actually quite a cute scene in that they have to use, like, mud. And they have to go get mud from, like, Miss Maudie's garden and stuff like that to build the body of the snowman and then cover it in snow.
Right.
So that's, like, barely any snow. That's not a lot of snow. That's, like, you know, the time I built a snowman living where I live in California.
That was 3 inches tall.
Yeah, it was a little bit taller. It was, like, a full one of those pencil height, you know?
Wow.
Which is like 4 to 5 inches. But we built a freaking snowman.
Good for you.
We did build a snowman.
The most memorable snow in North Carolina, by the way, was about 24 inches when I was a kid.
Wow.
So that was a big one.
That is a big one. So did it snow pretty regularly where you lived?
Like, not every year, no.
But it...
Every other year, sometimes a couple times a winter, you know.
Sometimes, so it would, like, maybe snow once a year, twice a year kind of thing?
Yeah, it depended on the year. I mean, there were a handful of times where it did quite a bit, actually.
I mean, 24 inches is a lot of snow.
We had a lot of sleet, too.
Yeah. See, where we live now, we don't get, like... I mean, maybe this winter we'll get snow. It's looking like we might. But,
At least nearby.
At least nearby. Well, we always get snow nearby. But, yeah, it's, we don't get a lot of snow here.
No.
So I thought that was a really cute scene.
It is cute.
I would have just built a tiny snowman, but they were like, we're going to build a real one. Anyway, Miss Maudie's house catches on fire. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of why it's important that it's snowing, is that it's so cold. They all have their fires really burning, and she leaves one of the fires in the kitchen burning. Mm-hmm. And being a Californian, we are so fire conscious that they're like, we're going to sleep with the fire lit. And I was like, oh no, you're not. No, you are not going to sleep with the fire lit unless you're sleeping in the room with that fire.
Right.
Like, you taking turns watching that fire. So her house goes up in flames, and I think it's like threatening a bunch of the houses around, including the Finch household, the Finches being Scout, Jim, and Atticus. Yeah. And then while they're watching this happen, someone drapes a blanket over Scout's shoulders. And they don't know who it is. Mm-hmm. And Atticus is like, I thought I told you kids to stay on the corner. And they're like, we did stay on the corner. And he's like, where'd you get that blanket from? And they're like, what blanket? And then they're like, oh, we don't know when it got here. Which is really funny. Yeah, so the house catches on fire, and then Jim tells Atticus about the knot hole with the candies and soap figures and all this stuff in it. And Atticus is like, okay.
Yeah.
Atticus
that's nice.
Is like, I kind of picture him as going to bed with his head in his hands every night, being like, how did I get these two kids? They're just so rambunctious and wild and, like, driving him up the wall.
But they mean well.
They do mean well. After that, that's when we get the first real instance of references to the case that Atticus has taken on, but we don't really know why he's just being referred to as an N-word lover, and Scout doesn't really know what that means,
right?
But knows it's an insult.
Yeah, and that's really the common thread amongst most of her fighting is someone insulting her father.
Yeah, basically.
So a lot of what you're talking about doesn't happen in the movie.
Yeah.
There's no fire, there's no blanket, there's no,
yeah.
you know. They end up, basically, it's just the situation where they go up to the house, they find the stuff in the tree knothole, which is kind of like the central piece of all the, you know, kind of things that ultimately we find out are Boo Radley, right?
Yeah.
And so it kind of touches on all those things to the point that it needs to include it in the story in the movie, but it doesn't centralize it. Yeah. Or it doesn't go into all the details about each individual thing that happens.
Yeah. Yeah, so they really have a lot of, like, they went to school, they found this in the knothole. They went to school, they found this in the knothole. They went to school, they found this in the knothole. And then it gets filled with cement.
Right.
Which was Mr. Nathan Radley is doing. And
so Nathan definitely is the older brother.
Yeah, he's the brother of Boo Radley.
Okay, because in the movie they never name anyone but Arthur. Okay, they just refer to him as Mr. Radley. It's not. There's no implication that he has a brother, at least not that's living there.
Yeah,
and so I think it kind of skips over the fact that the dad died.
Yeah,
and it instead just keeps him in the place that Nathan is in the book.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Because...
So it's Mr. Radley that cements it up.
Yeah. So instead of Mr. Arthur Radley being Arthur Sr., because Boo Radley is also Arthur.
Right.
It is Nathan Radley.
Yeah.
But they're basically one and the same. I mean, even in the book, they serve almost the identical purpose, other than Nathan Radley is a little bit nicer.
Right.
Like, that's the only difference, is that they said that Mr. Arthur Radley would, like, cough in response to them saying, "Good morning, Mr. Radley." Mm-hmm. And Mr. Nathan Radley would actually say, like, "Good morning, kids." Like, that's the difference.
Not enough of a difference to matter, really.
Yeah, like, it's okay to, I think, make them one character.
It makes sense for the movie.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's why I have to give credit. Like, they really cut where they needed to, I think. Like,
yeah, that's what it sounds like.
You know, there's some things that fall by the wayside because of that, but, you know.
Yeah. And it is, like, you're right, the first half of the book really is just getting to know the life there. Yeah. And when you're dealing with something that's only 2 hours long, you're like, no, we gotta cut to the chase. Mm-hmm. We're not writing a book that's going to wander. We're making a movie that, one, has to sell, and two, has to have a plot because it has to sell.
Yeah.
So,
which I, you know, in the book I still find enjoyable. You know, just kind of these little childhood experiences and things. Like, I think it's fun.
Yeah.
You know, maybe you found it a bit meandering or something, but...
I just wanted more of something to tie it together. You know, I just didn't really care to read a book about just stuff happening. Yeah. Felt a little mundane to me. I
mean, I think it at least tying, like, the whole Boo Radley thing together from beginning to the end really works. And it, you know, kind of complements a lot of the other lessons and things that are learned along the way. But
yeah, I like that. And that's also a good, it's a good moment where we really see Scout grow up. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
Does Atticus shoot the mad dog in the movie? Yeah, so there's this whole thing about how Jim and Scout get guns for Christmas. Mm-hmm. And Atticus refuses to teach them to shoot. But then it turns out he's, like, the best shot in makeup. And it's literally the sheriff's like, "I'm not a very good shot, Atticus. You have
to do it.
You have to shoot the dog. There's no missing."
Right.
Like, you gotta shoot the dog. And the dog does have rabies.
Yes.
So, unfortunately, spoiler alert, the dog dies.
Yes. But it had to happen.
It did have to happen. I think this is also kind of part of my problem with the story, is that, like, the dog is never mentioned until that part. There's this whole, like, all these people who I feel like could have been more throughout, but it's really just a couple of them who get to be there throughout.
Sure.
And then a few of them who pop up when it's convenient, like the dog, you know. And maybe she didn't want you to have a huge emotional attachment to the dog, which
Probably
is
not.
fair.
I mean, I don't remember how it's presented in the book. In the movie, it's kind of just like, oh, this dog, like, wandered in.
Yeah.
Day, you know,
So,
which could happen.
Yeah, and I would say in the book, Jim and Scout are walking. I think they're walking home from school, and they see this dog, like, twitching and, like, meh. And they go to Calpurnia, and they're like, there's a dog that's sick, and we need your help. And Calpurnia, like, goes out and is like, oh, that's a mad dog. And she, like, calls everyone, and she's, like, yelling, like, there's a mad dog coming this way, get in your houses, there's a mad dog. And mad dog. And so then she basically gets everyone safe and gets everyone in, gets the kids inside, kind of, but they're all watching. And then Atticus comes home with the sheriff, and the sheriff is then like, you gotta shoot the dog. And I'm like, why are you the sheriff?
Small town policing, man.
Yeah. Like, what are you, who, yeah. I mean,
They don't really do a whole lot.
He's the one who signed. I feel like the one thing they'd be able to do is shoot, you know?
You would think that, but...
Yeah.
You know. Remember all the stories I've told you about my time in the army?
That's true.
Where all the, like, really crazy gun people couldn't shoot for shit. And I outshot all of them.
That's true. That's true. This is a good time to brag and say you could even outshoot your own sergeant.
I sure could.
And that was always a fun little competition between you two. But so the dog dies. Sorry about that. But there's really no attachment to the dog.
No.
At least not much of one. And that's when Mrs. DuBose comes in.
Yes.
Is she in?
Very briefly.
Very briefly.
She's just a crotchety old lady that's on the porch next door, pretty much.
Does she die?
No, I don't think so.
Because in the book, there's this whole... It's sort of more like an anthology.
Uh-huh.
I would say.
Right, there's these little small stories happening in the...
Yeah, and now I'm almost thinking I wish it was presented more as an anthology.
Yeah.
Than...
The way I think about it is just that it's like, again, it's someone looking back on their childhood, right? So it's all these little flashes of things.
Yeah.
Right? That's how the memory works, kind of. So that's the way I choose to look at it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Even though narratively, like, structurally, it might, not always work. But, like, that's just the way that I think about it.
Yeah. Well, Mrs. DuBose is a cantankerous old lady.
Cantankerous, indeed.
The most cantankerous. But she yells some profanities at the children.
Oh, yeah.
And so Jim is like, I'm going to destroy her camellia bushes. And he just wreaks havoc on them and gets in trouble. So he has to go read to her every day. And then it turns out she's a morphine addict.
Right. There's a whole thing about her addiction and everything.
And she's just trying to conquer her addiction before she dies. And that's like one way that she kind of kills time is by having him read to her.
Right.
And they don't really realize it, but like she has a timer that's going longer and longer to keep her addiction like longer. Like, what am I trying to say?
I don't know.
So there's more time between morphine uses, I think.
Oh.
So they're like, gosh, it feels like this timer where I'm reading is getting so long. And it is. Because she's trying to space it out more and more to wean herself off.
Right.
That's how addiction works. She's doing it right.
Yeah.
You do not just cut yourself cold turkey all the time. Get help if you need it. Anyway, when she dies, she leaves Jim a box with a single camellia in it. And I was like, that's a real slap to the face.
Yeah. But it's fun. Like, I like it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
So none of that is really done in the movie. I think there's like a vague reference to Jim having to go read to her at some point, but it's not like a central thing that's talked about. Basically, the only, use of Mrs. DuBose in the movie is pretty early on, like kind of, it's basically like Scout and Jim like walking the neighborhood, and that's how it like introduces all these different neighbors and things.
Oh, I like that.
It works very well for the movie.
Yeah.
And so they go past her house, and of course she's like yelling things at her, and they're like, you have to be careful. Like, I think they say that she has like a gun underneath her.
Yeah.
Like her little shawl that she wears or whatever, and that like you can't like look at her too long or she might shoot you or something, and so basically like they are going past the house trying not to maintain eye contact with her, and then Atticus comes around the corner and they start walking with him, and so he goes up while she's yelling, and just like it's basically used as a way to show the type of character that Atticus has, where he clearly doesn't like her, or whatever, and doesn't agree with the way she talks or thinks or any of this stuff, but it's like showing how he's able to get along and kind of, warm himself up to pretty much anybody.
Yeah.
That's how it's used.
Yeah, he's a really good lawyer.
Yeah, exactly.
Really, really good lawyer. So after that, that's about when Atticus is out somewhere, and Calpurnia takes the two kids to her church. They're not super welcomed by some people, but other people they are welcomed by. You definitely see the, like, dynamic. Yeah. As the kids are walking in, and this, like, how they're, like, referring to them as, like, Miss Atticus, or Miss Finch and stuff like that, and they're, like, parting for these, like, two little white kids.
Right.
So you do see that dynamic at play.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So none of that part is in the movie, and it makes sense narratively that it's not.
Yeah.
But I do feel like that's, like, kind of an important scene.
Yeah.
Like, it gives some of that perspective, and that's something that's not found in the movie. Like, Calpurnia she's just not explored as much in the film. Like, she's a central part.
Yeah.
And definitely, like, kind of her place in the family is shown. The fact that she's able to discipline the children is shown.
Yeah.
That Atticus clearly has a lot of respect for her, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, some of that deeper parts of, like, her taking them to the church and showing her side of life and stuff like that is not really, like, I don't think it's, like, deeply explored in the book either, but, like,
no,
it's just really not found in the film.
Yeah. I do think it was interesting that they really showed that dynamic, and obviously this is a kid, so it's not really explored beyond the surface level.
Sure.
So I'm gonna, I guess, give it kind of a surface level pass here, where they're just talking about these black people parting for these two white kids.
Yeah.
But I think it's actually a really interesting scene, and it does kind of serve to really start showing the dynamic as they start to amp up and as we start to head toward the court case. Mm-hmm. Does Aunt Alexandra show up in the movie?
No, I don't think so.
Because she moves in with them at this point.
Right. And is she the one that kind of gets into it with Cal at some point?
Yeah. And she's trying to say that Cal shouldn't be there. And you're really starting to see the divide between, these white people and how they're treating black people.
Yeah, no, I don't think that happens at any point. There's someone, now I'm trying to remember. I could be misremembering. There is another character that doesn't come to stay with them, but is, like, around the house a lot, and I think it was Miss Maudie in the movie.
Yeah, it would make sense to kind of condense a few of these characters.
But she doesn't get into a fight with Cal or anything, but... Yeah, I think that was her in the movie.
Yeah. So this is really where things start to amp up. Dill appears again. Mm-hmm. He's hiding under Scout's bed.
Which, by the way, I've been meaning to say this multiple times since we started talking about Dill. The fact that Harper Lee grew up with Truman Capote.
Oh, yeah.
And Dill is supposed to be Truman Capote. Isn't that not amazing?
That's pretty, yeah.
Like, that's fantastic.
That's pretty cool.
Like, that was her experience as a kid, was that Truman Capote would come and visit and spend summers in their town.
That's pretty great.
And they continued to be lifelong friends.
Oh, I love that. But that's when this iconic lynch mob scene happens.
Yes.
Where Atticus...
Okay, well, let's set up some of this. Okay. We haven't even discussed why this court case is happening.
That's true.
Or who's involved or any of this.
That's true. Actually, the book opens with describing what happens to Tom Robinson.
Okay.
Tom Robinson is a black man who's been accused of raping Bob Ewell? What's his first name?
That's the father.
Yeah,
right?
Bob Ewell's daughter,
Mayella
Ewell. And
so the Ewells are a white family.
Yes.
Not well off, but not,
Yes.
super poor or anything.
yeah, and no one really likes them, at
No.
least in the middle class.
Bob's a drunk.
Yeah.
He's always kind of stirring up trouble here and there.
Yeah, their kids only go to school on the first day of the year to fulfill,
Right.
their presence. So Tom Robinson is finally, he's in jail. He's being moved from one jail to another. And
They know there's some unrest in the town, so they kind of move him further away to a more secure place.
yes, and that's when the sheriff, Heck Tate, aka can't shoot for shit, tells Atticus, hey, I think there's going to be a lynch mob tonight.
Yeah, it's the same in the movie. I mean, there's a little more, lead up to that, I guess, where, he takes on the case. This is when, he, Scout starts to understand some of what's going on.
Yeah.
And, that's when people start insulting Atticus around her and stuff. And, all this is happening in the lead up to this. There's some, confrontation with Bob himself. He kind of confronts Atticus in front of the kids and is like, how could you do this to us? Basically, you're a race traitor kind of thing, And he, in the movie, he gives the line of, what kind of man are you?
Yeah.
Which really caught my attention,
Yeah.
And so then, so there's all this kind of back and forth leading up to it. And then it becomes the night before the trial is meant to start. And that's when they move Tom back to town. And they put him in the jail just for that night. And then that's when they start to, worry something's probably going to happen.
Yeah, and Jim is really worried about this. Scout understands it a little bit less, so we're kind of dragged along by Jim and Dill, or kind of go to this jail in the middle of the night, find Atticus sitting outside and reading.
Yeah.
And this huge group of men appear, and they're telling Atticus, hey, get out of the way.
Does it mention who is in this lynch mob?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
There's the Cunningham father is one of the most notable people.
Right. In the film, he's kind of like the spokesman.
Yeah.
He's clearly the leader of this mob.
Yeah, and he's the one who Scout is able to kind of oh, hey, Mr. Cunningham, don't you recognize me? I go to school with your son. Because she does not understand this is a lynch mob at all.
Right.
She ends up in the middle of it, just trying to talk to him.
And it's unclear to me. So, I mean, basically, the mob comes up to the building, they start confronting Atticus, and the kids are kind of watching.
Yeah.
And they see that it's starting to heat up, right? So they run up to their father to protect him, basically.
Yeah.
It's unclear to me how much Scout understands what's happening. Because you're saying, from your perspective, you don't think she gets it at all. It's just her being a kid, which, given her age, would make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Right? But there is almost an implication, especially in the movie, there is kind of an implication that she knows what she's doing, where she's, playing the part of the kid that doesn't know what's going on, you know what I mean?
Okay.
It's kind of hard to say, but yeah, so she basically just is, warming up to him, you know, hey, I remember you came by our house. And, I know your son.
Yeah, so in the book, she doesn't really know, and what she's doing is she's just trying to be polite.
Right.
Where she's saying that her father always told her to, talk to people and talk about stuff they like, and then towards the end of being, in the middle of this mob, she's like, oh, I think there's something more going on here.
Oh, okay.
But I don't think she ever fully grasps that what a lynch mob really is.
Yeah. She just sees a bunch of angry people.
yeah, and she realizes, oh, they're really mad at Atticus.
Yeah.
Jim goes out and he's he knows it's a lynch mob.
Mm-hmm.
And he is a little bit older now. I think he's 12 or something.
Something like that.
And she's 8.
Mm-hmm.
So he is ready to defend his father. And Atticus is go home, take your sister and Dylan, go home.
Yep.
And Scout's just running out and just being oh, hey, Mr. Cunningham. Funny seeing you here. What's going on?
Yeah, so basically, she does all this and it kind of, I mean, essentially, like, embarrasses them to the point of them leaving.
Yeah.
That's, it kind of, I mean, not only is she, like, physically placing herself in between, like, they're not going to,
Yeah.
harm an 8-year-old white girl.
Yeah.
But, like, also just how friendly she's being. Like, she's basically embodying the type of person that Atticus has taught her to be, right?
Yeah.
In that situation. And so it's, like, a very clear thing of, like, I mean, again, this is where we get into, like, how kind of, overly optimistic is this story and its lessons.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I think that, like, proving that some amount of being an empathetic person, like being that model person that you think people should be like, is still more powerful than not, right?
Yeah.
So, like, even if that might not have worked, that, like, not every time just being the better person is not always going to stop bad things from happening. But, like, in this case, that's what happens, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it helps if you're an 8-year-old girl.
It does help.
Because, like, that is a big thing where they're like, come on, guys, there are kids here. This little girl, let's get out of here. Let's not do this.
Right.
But yeah, I think you're right. And she does explicitly say about how her father taught her to do these things. Mm-hmm. And that's why she's doing them.
Yep.
And that's when we get to the trial.
Yep. Trial happens the next day.
Yeah. Kind of a big thing. Everyone is there basically except for Miss Maudie.
Right.
She does not approve of watching these things. There's all these testimonies going on, and, like, right off the bat, there's something fishy going on.
Right. Okay, so just to set it up a little bit more, like, this is clearly, like, a really big deal.
Yes.
Everyone from town comes out. It seems like even people from out of town have come.
Yes,
There's all these cars driving around, and so the kids are very, very excited. Right?
Yeah.
Like, not just because their father is at the center of this, but, like, they know that there's been quite a lead up to this, and that this is clearly a very big deal. Like, the most exciting thing that's ever happened in this town, basically.
Yeah.
So, of course, they, against their father's wishes, go to the courthouse.
Yes,
to
they
watch
do.
this, which is why we're able to still see this from her perspective.
Yes, and this may be one of those parts where they're, like, is probably a point of contention, but they go sit in the black balcony.
Yeah.
And it's all these black people basically just making room for these 3 white kids.
Right. Like, they can't get in.
Yeah.
But so this is where, like, it just sort of happens in the movie. There's no setup, but, like, they knew Reverend Sykes from going to Cal's church, right? So in this case, it's just, like, implied, like, oh, he's just someone in the town they know. So they're trying to get in, they can't get in, and they're like, oh, hey, Reverend Sykes, and he's like, come on with me,
Yeah, that's exactly it. And in the book, I think 3 people or something like that give up their seats for them. Right. But yeah, so they're sitting up there watching, and then we basically just watch the trial unfold.
Yes.
With Bob Ewell's testimony, Mayella Ewell's testimony, and then Tom Robinson's testimony.
Right.
And Bob Ewell says that he was out, like, chopping wood or something, can't remember, and he comes home, hears his daughter screaming.
Yep.
And he sees through the window his daughter being assaulted by Tom Robinson.
Right.
So he runs in and he chases him away. And his daughter is, like, covered in bruises. And she has... Oh, they also get the sheriff's testimony.
Okay.
And she has choke marks. She has bruises on the left side of... No, hold on. I'm sorry. I'm motioning at Alan to, like, punch him. On the right side of her face.
The right side. She has a black eye on the right side.
Exactly. So they say that the right side of her face was all messed up. Atticus has Bob Ewell write his name, and he is left-handed.
And he's very slick about it.
Yes. He is. So
he proves that he's left-handed.
Yeah.
And then moves on to Tom.
Yes. So, they have Tom stand up at some point when talking to Mayella. And they're like, this is the man? And that's when Scout realizes his left arm is crippled. It's shorter than his right arm. When he goes to take his oath, he has to, like, literally pick it up with his right hand and put his left hand on the Bible, and it slides off.
Right.
Like, he can't do much with that arm.
Yeah.
So that's when it starts to be a really big point that the bruises were on the right side of her face.
Right. It really matters. It's both that it's the right eye coming from a left-handed punch.
Yes.
And like choke marks that could only be done with the left hand.
Yeah, exactly. I think in the book it's like both hands or something like that.
Okay.
And it's like he couldn't have choked her with both hands. He can't do that. And so Mayella gives the same testimony as her father. Tom Robinson gives his own testimony, which is that Mayella Ewell came onto him.
Right.
And Bob Ewell saw that and threatened to kill his own daughter.
Yes, exactly. So the kind of sequence is that, you know, so she, in the movie, she gives this testimony, right? That's very, you know, she's blubbering and like, but you can like very much tell that this is a scripted thing she's saying, right? Like she came prepared to say this exact thing. She's having trouble getting through it. She gets questioned by Atticus and just falls apart, basically.
Yeah.
She can't, you know, it's like very, very obvious that this is being made up.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, once Tom comes to the stand, he sort of reveals that there's much, much more to it. Like that, you know, she claims that he had only come to the house one time when she called him over to break up this chifforobe.
Yep.
And like, that was it. And then that's when it happened, right?
Question. What is a chifforobe?
A chifforobe is like, it's a piece of furniture. So it's like a cabinet, but it's one that has like the shelves on one side and then hanging on the other.
Yeah.
It's just a closed cabinet.
Okay. This is very specific.
Yeah. But yeah, so she claims that he only came the one time. He reveals that, you know, he worked in a field nearby, and so he would always pass by their house on his way home.
I think it's also notable to say that he has a wife and kids.
Yes.
Helen? Yeah, Helen Robinson is his wife, and he has, I think, 2 kids.
2 kids, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, he reveals that, and that she had called him over to the house multiple times, that she was clearly very interested in talking to him and having him around.
Yeah.
And she, like, he was under the impression that she was always coming up with excuses to bring him behind the fence into their house. You know?
Yeah. And that this time, she had specifically asked him to come into the house. And he was up on a stool to change something or do something, and she like grabbed his legs.
Yes.
And was trying to kiss him and stuff like that.
Basically, physically, sexually assaults him.
Yeah.
Throws herself on him, and then that's when Bob sees them through the window.
Yes.
He clearly knows what actually happened, right?
Yes.
Like Tom testifies that he heard him say that he's going to kill her.
Yeah.
You know, and that, you know, essentially he beats her up, and then, you know, they invent this story later on. Yeah.
Because it's easier to blame a black man than have your white daughter.
I mean, just, that would be like the most shameful thing, right? Like, because you're trying to live in this one world where, you know, black people aren't people, and, you know, white people are more respected, and all this stuff, but then the reality is, it's, you know, and that's what I enjoy about it. It's such a simple story in a way.
Yeah.
But it's really hitting on some of these really big points throughout, especially Southern American history. Yeah. Where, like, you have all these slave owners. It's like, well, why are there so many mixed race people in the South? And it's like, because slave owners would have sex with their slaves.
Or just rape the slaves.
I mean, yes, of course. Like, but I mean, most of the time it wasn't consensual. Yeah. You know, and this is anyone from, you know, politicians like Thomas Jefferson down to just anyone. So it's like, it's such a big point of history that this is talking about. And the fact that throughout time and even up until modern day, the excuse of a black man assaulting a white woman has been used constantly to get people out of things. Yeah. You know? Yeah. So this is, you know, I know that there's some of that debate about the controversy of this is, you know, is it appropriate to tell this story about rape or you know, this or that, or, you know, use all these words and things, but it's like, that's such a part of what has happened in this country.
Yeah, it's real. Yeah. You know, and it's, like you say, still going on to this day. Mm-hmm. Like, people still like to cry wolf at a black man. Yep. Because of stereotypes and racism. So it does really, really hold true.
Yeah. I mean, this is set, right around the time that stuff like Birth of a Nation came out. You know? It's like, this is like really, post-Civil War, like Reconstruction era, like this is what Jim Crow, what was happening,
Yeah, and there were people who fought for the Confederacy in this book.
Right.
Like, that's like how far back we're going and what kind of culture we're going to.
Right.
And that's, that's how it was.
Yeah.
So do Scout and Dill leave the courthouse at all, or do they stay in the courthouse?
No, they stay.
So there is a little moment where they go out and they talk to Dolphus Raymond, who says that he prefers hanging out with black people. I think his wife is black. And then they go back in, and that's when Calpurnia is like, the kids aren't at home. And Atticus is like, you guys have to go home. They go home, they come back to see the verdict.
Okay. Yeah, no, that happened in the movie.
Yeah. I think why it's so important in the book that all of that happens is because the jury takes a really long time.
Yeah. In the film, it says almost 2 hours.
Yeah. So that's very notable because we'll maybe jump around a little bit here, but afterwards, Jim is like so furious that Atticus lost the case. Tom Robinson is convicted as guilty, even though it's so obvious he's not guilty.
Right. Like Atticus makes this like super heartfelt speech.
Yeah.
Right before they go to deliberate.
Yeah.
Where he culminates everything that he's proven.
Yeah.
Very clearly highlights that this is obviously made up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, they still convict him.
They convict him. But Miss Maudie says, he was convicted as guilty, but think about how long the jury took. That's why they picked Atticus.
Right.
It's not because they thought he would win, but because he would make some kind of difference.
Right.
And that difference is that the jury took way longer than they ever had before, or than they ever thought they would.
Not clear cut like this, He went in expecting to lose.
Yeah.
Even though he knew what was right.
Yeah.
He knows the kind of people he's working with here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So he is trying to file for an appeal, and that's...
Well, one other thing I want to mention
that
at least happened in the movie, I don't know if this is in which is like, it's both like a really nice moment in the movie, and it's also like a really big kind of point for the side of, is this a white savior story?
Oh, okay.
Which is that, Atticus loses, the verdict is announced, they take Tom Robinson out, the prosecutors leave, the jury leaves, everyone leaves. All the white people on the bottom leave, and then all the black people stay in the balcony.
Yeah.
Along with the kids, right?
Yeah.
And so they kind of just watch Atticus slowly packing up his stuff. And then, he's like exiting the courthouse, and everyone is giving him they all stand up and are like clearly showing him the sign of respect for what he's done.
Yeah.
Trying to make justice happen.
That is a little white savior.
It is, but given the story up to this point, it's like it is a nice moment. And,
yeah, it is, and it is nice to show acknowledgement and coming together as opposed to just everyone filing out all together.
Right. Especially from the viewpoint of the kids seeing that. Especially because Scout has dealt with so many people insulting her father.
Yes.
And the whole town being against him and all this stuff. And so for them to be able to see that no, he has garnered this level of respect from people for doing the right thing.
Yeah.
It's important. It is a little tug on your heartstrings white savory, but it is ultimately an important thing for them to see.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's then they're filing for an appeal, and Atticus actually says he feels pretty good about the appeal.
Yeah.
And Tom Robinson does not feel good about the appeal, and he tries to escape prison.
Yeah.
And
he's being transported back to a prison somewhere. And
is he being transported when he escapes? In the book, he's in the yard.
Oh, okay.
And he tries to climb the fence.
Oh, okay.
And they say that someone with 2 good arms would have made it over the fence. But he didn't, and he gets shot and he dies. And
he gets shot 17 times or something.
Does he?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So that's obviously really terrible, but when he dies, an editorial is written saying that an innocent man was murdered.
Right.
So yeah, he is quite a tragic up to this point, at least.
It's really...
And I feel like Tom Robinson is one of those characters that, like, he doesn't really get to say much. He's kind of just a plot point, unfortunately, and he ends up dying.
Right.
So he is one of those characters where you're a little bit like, oh, I see where they could have gone farther, where he could have been a lot deeper.
Sure.
Where he was mostly used as a plot point to illustrate things.
Yeah.
He's, I believe, described as having, like, either velvety or chocolate skin. And someone is described as having chocolate, someone is described as having velvety. So there's also that, like, sense of fetishizing and, like, how it's described, how skin color is described. So I think he could have been a lot deeper, and they could have done more with him, and we could have seen more with him. Again, it is from Scout's perspective, so how much would we have seen of him?
Sure.
But the fact that he gets shot, to me, is a little bit like, okay, yeah, it's like his story is done with.
Yeah.
And I think she was trying to illustrate a point there, but I don't think it, at least in the modern context, I don't think it works for me.
Right. I don't think that holds a whole lot of power anymore. And it just makes it, one of the things that I've heard criticism about is that, this is something that can be a very poignant story for a white audience, but it just feels like super depressing for a black audience.
Yeah, I saw that white students were, like, inspired by it, whereas black students were demoralized by it.
And that I think that is a huge reason why that would happen.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, amongst many other things, but that's kind of like the nail in the coffin, literally. Yeah. And it's like, what does it actually serve to the story?
Yeah, absolutely. Other than just to be another tug at your heartstring, feel bad moment.
Right, exactly.
When he, like, is this, like, this is supposed to be a person whose life we're talking about, and it's like, okay, and it's over. And then they move on.
Right.
Like,
which is like, in some ways it's like, okay, I've been critical about, like, the overly optimistic nature of some of it.
Yeah.
And this is the complete opposite of that, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, to some degree, it is like this, like, tinge of realism, like, being the good person won't always solve the problem.
Yeah.
And I don't fully know what that's trying to communicate.
Yeah.
And that's fine, but it's like, I don't know.
I mean, I think that tinge of realism, almost cynicism, is enough with the guilty verdict.
Right. Like, I think that you're right, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that it's almost like we couldn't have the appeal just hanging out there.
Yeah.
Which I actually think it would have been interesting to have the appeal left open at the end.
Which it's tough given that it's an adult looking back, so she would know the ultimate result of that.
But she doesn't have to say it.
But she doesn't have to say it. You're right.
She can just say, and then this is the end of the story.
Right.
And the appeal was, like, left open, and, that's it. You don't have... That's how I would say most stories are.
Yeah.
They are told in the past tense, and there's often a few things that, like, wait, but what happened later? What happened after? So I think that would have been perfectly fine.
Right.
We don't need to know what happened with the appeal necessarily, and that could be a point of hope for us, or it can be a point of conversation or whatever, you know what I mean? But it is like he dies and then they're like, and it's Halloween.
Yeah, it kind of just, things move on.
Yeah. So they, I guess there is a little bit of, like, Helen Robinson getting followed by Bob Ewell.
Right.
There is some harassment lingering.
In the film, basically, the day that Tom dies, Atticus was going over to their house to discuss the appeal anyway.
Yeah.
And he's the one that ends up delivering the news that he's dead to the family.
Yeah.
And then, there's, like, a moment where I think it's just Jim that's with him.
Jim and Dill in the book, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
But they're, like, kind of witnessing that Bob comes up to the house. Bob Ewell comes up to the house and is, kind of, like, threatening them. Like, he knows Atticus is inside, and he's like, get him out here right now.
Yeah.
And, like, he's gonna fight him, basically.
Yeah. So that obviously happens faster
Yeah.
in the movie, where in the book it's kind of spread out, where he goes to say, give the bad news. He encounters Bob Ewell somewhere else and gets like his face spat on.
Right, that's what happened. He comes outside. Atticus doesn't really say anything.
Yeah.
Bob spits on him.
Yeah.
And then he just kind of walks away and gets in the car and drives away.
Yeah. And Bob Ewell loses his job over this.
He does.
So he does get a little bit of comeuppance.
Right.
Like,
okay.
people know that something's going on and they don't want to associate with someone like him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like, everyone will protect their own, you know, to some degree, but then there's still this, like, he's lost his kind of status, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like people are willing to turn a blind eye to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
They're not willing to, like, completely be like, no, you didn't beat your daughter. They're like, we're gonna say this one instance happened. You're a bad person.
Right.
So they're, like, kind of doing both. Like, they have their feet in both rivers,
Right.
or whatever the saying is.
And if I remember correctly, there's even an implication that he had been sexually assaulting his own daughter.
Yeah, I think so.
Which is not really talked about in the film, but I think is in the book.
Yeah, I think so. And then that's when it's Halloween.
Yes.
There's a pageant. Scout is dressed as a ham, and she's very proud of it.
Is that how she goes to the...
No,
Because there's a very funny scene where, like, it's, you know, a fun thing between siblings there where, like, it doesn't show anything that happens, but basically she just comes out as they're leaving in a ham costume, and Jim's like, well, what'd you lose your dress for? Like, what happened? You know, it's just very funny.
no, I don't think it's quite like that, but that is how it should have been. But they go, I think he's carrying the ham costume for her. And they do the pageant. She falls asleep backstage. Mm-hmm. And they're like, pork! Pork! And she's like, runs out late and all that stuff, which feels like it felt so accurate to how children's plays are.
Sure.
Like,
just an absolute mess.
Running out super late. Yeah, it was really funny. And then on their way home, she's forgotten her shoes or something like that. And she's still in her ham costume. And they're walking home and they're attacked.
Yes.
At first they don't know who's attacking them. And they end up like, she's like in her ham costume.
Right.
It's all confusion.
Yeah.
She wriggles out of the ham costume and sees someone carrying Jim home.
Yes.
Like, it's just chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what it's like in the movie?
Yeah.
Okay.
Basically. I mean, again, you're seeing it from her perspective, so she's in this costume, and, like,
yeah,
it's just all kind of a whirlwind. She doesn't know what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not until they get back to the house that it's revealed that Bob Ewell attacked the children with a knife.
Right.
And that Boo Radley is the one who carries Jim home and and actually stabs Bob Ewell.
Right.
And the sheriff, who I like that he's also a reoccurring character, him and Miss Maudie, I like that we see them a few times. Yeah. That he's like, we're just gonna say that he fell on his knife.
Right, there's this whole thing where Atticus starts to be like, you know, so how are we gonna approach this? Atticus is under the impression that Jim was the one that stabbed him.
Yes.
You know, and then clearly that's not accurate, right?
Yeah.
But then he's still like, okay, well, you know, what are we gonna do about this? You know?
Yeah.
He's, you know, always the proper man. He wants to go through the correct channels and, you know, report things as they were. But then, you know, the sheriff is kind of pointing out, like, okay, but what about Boo Radley? Like, does he deserve this? You know, for a man that did all these evil things? Like, is it really worth it? And this is where, like, ultimately the title of the book comes back, right?
Yeah.
So Atticus earlier on has told Scout that it's a sin to kill a mockingbird because they don't do anything but, you know, sing beautiful songs for people. Yeah. They don't attack anyone. They don't do anything. Yeah. And so obviously that is the Boo Radley character, right? Yeah. He is the mockingbird in this situation. So, I think in the film, even Scout, somebody mentions that specific, like, he's the mockingbird, right? Yeah. And then that's when, you know, Atticus decides that the sheriff is right, that they should say that he fell on his knife. Yeah.
And the sheriff is very insistent, and he's like, they're going to have to go by my word, and no matter what you say, I'm going to say he fell on his knife. Like, the sheriff is not backing down at all.
You know, he's trying to incorporate justice the way he can in a system that is unjust.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But that's
Which I actually really like that point.
Yeah.
Because it's not saying, like, oh, well, you have to operate within the confines of the law or something. And, like, that's the one criticism that I've ever seen about Atticus as a character.
Yeah.
That he's, he's still part of, it's like a good cop or something.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you're still part of this system.
Yeah.
Which I agree with on a large scale.
Yeah.
And even the fact that he's, like, having to be, convinced not to go about it that way. But that ultimately the lesson is learned that, like, that's not always the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So it's about following your own moral compass rather than what society says is right or wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that's when we really get the end of the Boo Radley story. Mm-hmm. And Scout, like, Boo Radley asks Scout to walk him home. And she walks him home, and she's just she gets him there, and she just sort of imagines everything through his eyes and how he watched these kids all his life and how in a way they were his kids to care for and how he did stand up for them in the end. I mean, he stood up for them multiple times if you think about it.
Right. But this is where it all comes into focus for her, where she realizes that, he was the one doing all this stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is, that's essentially how it ends, right? Like, just her understanding that, and it kind of ties everything together. Yeah. And so it's like, you're moving on from, like, the trial being the central point to this other thing. Yeah. They're tied together in some ways. It's not perfect, but it does ultimately work, I think. Yeah. So I'm, now that we've gone through kind of the story, I'm curious, like, what are some of your thoughts about, like, the effectiveness of it, or where it falls short or doesn't, or...
I honestly wish I had not read it again.
Okay, like it lived better in the memory?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think it's a lot of the stuff I've just been saying. It just doesn't work for me.
But you're talking, like, narratively?
A lot of it is narratively. Okay. Some of the content, it is like, why did Tom Robinson have to be shot? I do feel like a lot of, like, I agree with a lot of the sentiments that, like, I do feel like a lot of the black characters are kind of caricatures or, like, cardboard cutouts,
Sure.
And I think it's difficult to really explore a lot of that stuff when you're telling it through the perspective of a child.
It is.
But I think it's
like, is that an excuse?
Yeah.
At the same time,
I still think it could have been done better. And that's when it comes down to story choices of, like, did Tom Robinson have to be shot? Could we have heard more about him earlier on, apart from, like, right at the beginning, and then it's not until way later on that we hear about him. And I think there are nowadays, especially children's stories, that do explore these topics quite in depth.
Absolutely.
And that's proof that nowadays we know how to do this better. Mm-hmm. I would say this is a book that I think lives in the time period it was written in.
It does. And like, certain things hold forward, but not everything.
Yeah, and I think that it, like, as far as things like school curriculum and stuff go, I think it served its purpose.
Yeah,
and
I don't disagree with that.
I think it's time to move on.
Yeah.
Again,
even if you use it in tandem with something else.
Yeah.
And it's important to give more perspective now in modern day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it was so influential in its time.
Yeah.
And that's, it's great because it was in a time where things weren't as understood as they are today.
No, exactly.
You didn't have the same perspectives from everyone. So
yeah.
Just having this one person kind of as this beacon of morality and kind of empathy in a town that doesn't otherwise have it was, like, really powerful.
Yeah, yeah. And I do think there's a lot of good things in the book, but I think on a second reading, especially as an adult, I was sort of just like, this doesn't resonate with me anymore, and I think it's time to, like, let it live in the past and let it go. And then just, like, narratively, I didn't care for the kind of wandering and how disjointed. I didn't care for how characters seemed to appear when it was convenient.
Sure.
And it was like I get the idea of, like, it was like you remember things in bursts or in moments, and, like, if I'm going to tell you a story about my dog, I'm not going to have woven in all the stories about my dog beforehand.
Right.
But
you're still reading it.
Yeah, but that's the thing. It is a novel at the end of the day. Right. It is a story presented like that. And, like, she wrote it down So theoretically, she could have woven all this stuff in and could have made a compelling through line.
Which not all of it's needed, but it's still...
Yeah.
I mean, again, even if there's a justifiable reason for why it's presented the way it is, it's still understandable why it wouldn't work as you're reading it.
Yeah, and that's how I feel. It didn't really work for me as I read it. And like honestly, I wanted to see the book from Atticus's perspective.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted. Like, that's the huge story, is like him balancing his home life while going through this trial that's like he feels really passionate about and has been assigned to him, but he still like feels passionate about, while balancing all these things, helping his kids navigate, working with, and I think through his perspective, maybe we also would have gotten more multidimensional characters. Mm-hmm. It's impossible to say.
He has the understanding, the context to go with it. Yeah.
And it is impossible to say, because maybe not. Maybe this is Harper Lee's, hey, I got it right. Harper Lee's perspective is just, she wrote it at a time when she was also still reckoning with things she learned, right?
Right.
So it's just kind of, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I ultimately agree that, like, I still find a lot of, powerful content in it.
Yeah.
But that I do agree that, like, it's not as poignant in this day and age as it maybe was back then.
Yeah.
Not to say that, like, many of the things that it highlights haven't persisted.
Yeah.
But, like, our societal understanding of it is very, very different.
Yes.
Even if not everyone, like, again... I grew up, 60 years after the point that this is set?
Yeah.
And a lot of those things still persisted. And so, again, it's like, I think that summary of, like, how, especially talking about the students, like how a white student might view it versus a black student.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm clearly only seeing it from that one side.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely understand the other side, but that it still holds power for me because of the way I was raised.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that the way it highlights some of these certain things are like, I mean, again, like, it's really covered up in the South, especially when you have a really conservative upbringing and stuff. Like, people they're not as open. Like, you're not going to have a lynch mob in the middle of town anymore.
No.
But people are still going to talk about things the same way. They're still going to have the same attitude.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I can't even tell you the number of times that, like, someone acts like a reasonable person on the outside and in public, and that I've gotten into a room with them alone, and they start just spewing racism at me because they assume I'm going to be on their side about it.
Yeah.
Like, that's happened to me so many times.
Yeah.
And it's like there's these little cliques and clubs when it comes to white people in the South sometimes. Obviously not everyone is like that, but, like... Yeah,
it's getting better.
It's so much of it is still there. It's just, like, under the surface instead of being overt.
Yeah.
And so I think it's still, like... I don't know, it sparks a lot of interesting thoughts in me.
Yeah.
Still about, like, where we are as a society, and especially in the South, like, how people are raised and how they look at things.
Yeah.
And it's still just, like, this ongoing thing of, I think that the class portion of this is also really important.
Yes.
Because, like, so many of the issues in our society really come down to class, but then people in power and people with interests turn it into race instead.
Yeah.
Right. I always think of that, like, that quote from LBJ, where he's just like, if you show, like, the poorest white man that he's better than the best black man, he'll do anything, you know, like, he'll line your pockets and he'll do, it's like the old politician's playbook, right?
Yeah, like turn us against them, make it,
And that's what it is. It's like people of a certain class that are not the elites share so much, but then they turn on each other for these other reasons that are manufactured.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's the kind of thing that this kind of story makes me think about, that, like, I mean, it's like, might seem surface level to you and me, but there's so many people that still don't understand that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So I think that for the right reader, this can still be a very powerful story.
Yeah.
And that for many other people, there are better ways to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And more up-to-date stories.
Yeah.
So,
what did you think of the movie, just as, like, a movie, not so much as, like, a lesson?
It's a great movie.
Great movie?
It's a great, like, courtroom drama.
Yeah.
With a lot of other things going on with it. I think that the idea of centering it around the case more so is brilliant.
Yeah.
It's exactly what it needed to be.
Yeah.
It cut exactly the right things out. And again, even if it does, like, cause some of the lessons or some of the other outside things to fall short a little bit, it still, like, combines it and it condenses it in a perfect way, I think.
Okay.
So I think it's not only a fantastic movie, but a really good adaptation of the points of the story that matter the most.
Okay. Kind of sounds like maybe the movie's better than the book.
I'd be very curious for you to watch it now.
Yeah, maybe I will
and just
watch
see
it.
if it works better for you.
Yeah.
Because again, like, I don't think the story's perfect, but I do think that the way that this movie, like, in other words, I think there's a very good reason why no one has touched this again.
Yeah.
Because it's just like, you know, I don't consider it like a 5 out of 5 masterpiece or anything.
But it's really good.
But it's a really good story.
Yeah.
And there's other movies that are similar that do stuff, like, I think a little bit better, like 12 Angry Men or something, kind of covers the same ideas in a different way.
Yeah.
But it's like more powerful as a movie.
Yeah.
But this is still just like a really strong adaptation.
Yeah. I'll check it out again. I think I'll check it out. Before we wrap up, do you have any other points you want to make?
Well, you know, I like to throw out some random fun facts and stuff.
Yes.
So, there's not a lot for this. It won the Best Adapted Screenplay at the Oscars that year.
Fair.
So, I mean, that's very poignant for our conversation, right? Like,
yeah.
Generally, people agree that this is a great adaptation.
Yeah.
Some other interesting things was that obviously Gregory Peck, like I said, was a great person to play Atticus in this. Mm-hmm. One of the other people who was brought up as an option originally was Jimmy Stewart, which could have been fascinating.
All right.
He ultimately turned it down because he thought the story was too controversial.
I mean, it is, I suppose.
It is, but I just want to know what that meant from him.
Yeah.
Like, that's a very there's no, like, you know, he doesn't expand on that at all.
Yeah.
Just curious what that meant. Yeah, that's really about it. One thing that I also thought was interesting is that our good old friend Roger Ebert did not like this movie.
Really?
Because he found it to be too white saviory.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which he didn't review it, like, contemporaneously, you know.
Oh, okay.
It was years later, but still just an interesting perspective.
That is an interesting perspective. I'm curious what he would have thought had he reviewed it at the time.
Yeah, same.
But sometimes it's hard to take yourself out of perspectives, or sometimes you just don't want to and you want to review it as is.
I mean, I live in both worlds, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think that you have to approach things in the context of when they were made.
Yeah.
And then also through a modern lens. You know?
Yeah.
Like, I think that's what we've done pretty effectively here.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you. And that's why I so often say, like, I think something should stay in its era, is because it was really valuable then.
Sure.
And it did something, and it was valuable. That's all I can say, really. And now we're ready to move and do more. And, you know, it's just about growing, and you can look at this book, and I think a really good way to view this book is to understand where we were in the 30s and where we were in the 60s and how far we've come. Yeah. And definitely keep having conversations about books that we can now move on to.
Yeah. Well, that's ultimately the thing. I don't think that this should, like, fall by the wayside.
No.
It should be talked about in terms of history. Right?
Yes.
Like, its impact.
Yes.
But that it's not necessarily the work that needs to be delved into to learn these same lessons. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I think that about sums up our thoughts. But before we sign off, Alan.
Your favorite time.
It's time for our tagline quiz.
What do you got?
What do I have? Whoops. Which was the one I wanted to do? Now I have to remember which one I was doing.
I feel good today.
You feel good?
Yeah.
All right.
It may be false confidence, but it's confidence.
I think you can get this one.
Okay.
Ready?
Sure.
Escape or die frying.
Escape or die frying.
Yep.
Frying.
Let me know if you need any hints.
Yeah, give me something.
The year is 2000.
2000.
We are wee babbies watching this movie. I watched it and loved it.
2000, not 2001.
Nope, 2000. I mean, maybe, remember, if you're thinking 2001, maybe that movie was made in 2000.
Maybe. So the first thing that it wouldn't be a very good tagline for the movie.
Yeah.
But it makes me think of Shrek.
No, it's not Shrek.
When they're escaping with the princess and the dragon is attacking them.
That would be really good for that specific one. And you're on the right track. It is an animated adventure. I'm going to give you a little hint, though. It's not CGI animation.
What?
It's not computer graphics. But it is technically classified as animation.
Technically, are we talking like rotoscope or something?
No, not rotoscope, no. It's something that I really love.
Is it stop motion?
It might be.
Okay.
It might be. You might even be able to get more specific than stop motion. I think I'm like sending you down a path.
Yeah, I don't know that this is helping anymore.
But it is stop motion.
Huh.
It has Mel Gibson, Julia Sawala, Phil Daniels. There are many animals involved. It's
Mel Gibson.
It's clay.
Is it Chicken Run?
Yes!
Ah!
It's Chicken Run, which is
Wow.
claymation.
Mel Gibson voiced Chicken Run?
I guess he did. When a cockerel apparently flies into a chicken farm, the chickens see him as an opportunity to escape their evil owners.
Yes. Rocky the Rooster, of course.
Rocky the Rooster. I have not seen that movie since it
Good
came out.
old Aardman animation.
I think I'm going to watch Chicken Run before I watch To Kill a Mockingbird.
Okay,
I'm going to
fair
do a
enough.
double feature.
Double feature,
A
naturally.
bird double feature.
I actually just watched the sequel to Chicken Run that was released last year, like last week.
I'm sorry.
Yes, there is a sequel.
That was released last year.
Last year.
Is it good?
It's on Netflix. No, not really.
Is it claymation?
Yeah.
Okay. Is it real claymation or is it CGI?
I don't think so.
Because you can see like the fingerprints in real claymation.
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it has nothing on the original Chicken Run. That
Yeah.
was one of my favorite movies as a kid.
Okay, I'll watch it with you.
I guess the tagline makes sense.
It does.
Right. But, okay, so my problem is they weren't making fried chicken. They were making pies.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So I don't know if that part is the best, but that's what really threw me.
But you got it.
I did get it.
So your score goes up by 1.
Right?
And I have no
puts me
idea.
at...
No idea what your score is. Someone else
Right.
is keeping track.
Okay. I also need to note that maybe this is too much. Chicken Run is the movie that ended up getting me in trouble as a kid.
Oh, yeah.
You remember this?
Yes, tell the story.
So I was homeschooled for a couple of years, but my mom was working full-time. Both of my parents were working full-time. So I had this, like, video series of, classes that I was supposed to watch. And naturally, as a middle school child, I would watch some of it. Like, I didn't do nothing.
Yeah.
But I skipped a lot of my work. And my parents weren't the best at double-checking behind me. So one day, my mom had to stay home from work, and I was, of course, watching my VHS copy of Chicken Run instead of doing my school, and I had it turned up a little too loud, and my mom heard it and was like, that doesn't sound like a class. And that is what ultimately got me in trouble for not doing my homeschool work, was watching Chicken Run in the middle of the day.
How dare Chicken Run betray you like that? How many times do you think you've seen Chicken Run?
Oh, God, 50 plus?
Because I've probably only seen it once.
Yeah, no, a lot of times.
But I gotta watch it again because I love that studio and I love
Yeah.
claymation.
No, it's great.
Yeah. All right. That's all for now.
I guess that'll do it.
Thank you for listening to In Contrast. I'm Nisha.
I'm Alan.
Let us know what you think in your opinions. You can find us at In Contrast Pod on Instagram and technically Twitter, but we haven't really been using it. Next up, we're going to be talking about The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman and its accompanying movie in the first season in a TV series.
Yes, because it is a trilogy of books, but we're only going to be discussing the first one.
Yes, we're only discussing the first one. And so we will see you all next time where we'll ask the important question, is the book really better than the movie?
Bye-bye.
Bye!